Hello and welcome to Behind the News. My name is Doug Henwood. We'll hear from the political economist Sam Gindin on competition and the working class. Sam Gindin has been on this show many times, alone and jointly with his longtime friend and collaborator, the late Leo Panitch. Sam spent a quarter century as the research director of the Canadian Auto Workers Union. Since then, he's taught and written. He is the co-author, along with Leo, of The Making of Global Capitalism, published by Verso, and co-author as well of The Socialist Challenge Today, published by Haymarket. He's got a review in Jacobin of Persistent Inequalities, Wage Disparities Under Capitalist Competition by Howard Botwinick, a 2018 reissue of a book originally published in 1993. The review has a lot about Botwinick's book, but is also full of Sam's observations on labor under capitalism and the unwisdom of encouraging more competition. Sam Gindin. So way back in the old days, we used to talk about a dual labor market, a monopoly labor market that had pretty high wages and a competitive labor market that didn't. First of all, was that ever true? And even if it was, is it at all true now?
Even when it was true, it had an awful lot to do with labor itself being strong enough to force results that weren't just based on competition, to force the companies to give them decent wages. But it was always fragile because the nature of capitalism, people used to think in those days particularly, but still do, that the nature of capitalism is that it goes from competition, a lot of small people competing with each other, to monopolization. And part of the monopolization thesis was exactly what you raised, that some workers could therefore be bought off by the monopolies, while others couldn't.
Those are the days of the labor aristocracy critique.
Yeah, that's exactly the point. Yeah, the labor aristocracy was the people who worked in, for the so-called monopoly. So what was always true about the development of capitalism is that it moved towards concentration and centralization and bigger companies. But the reality of competition is that it's part of the making of capitalism. The making of capitalism led to more competition over time, not less. As these companies were concentrated and became larger, they had the resources to compete. They had the research to compete. They had the ability to cross sectors. Aluminum companies would compete with steel companies for auto parts. Competition has always been about mobility. So the more mobile these companies became, the more competition there was, and the more finance developed. Finance became, a vehicle for intensifying competition. And, you see it going global in terms of competition. And so we're in a period of more competition. And that's crucial because we end up by making mistakes, both in terms of the aristocracy of labor issue, that over time, as long as part of the labor movement was weak, you couldn't maintain a privileged position in other parts, but also because the companies themselves had pressure on them that was competitive to undermine those wages. And then you see it in other ways. You see Corbyn and Sanders both emphasizing that the way to democratize the economy is to put workers on boards of directors. Now, aside from the fact that just being sitting there all of a sudden on a board of directors wouldn't change power relationships and how decisions were made in corporations. The fact of competition meant that if the context wasn't changed, there was this pressure on you to actually be integrated into those companies and worry about more about competition, which workers already always face this question of being dependent on their corporation. So this question of...
There's an aspect of psychology here. If you put a worker on the board or a workers' representative on the board, they will probably tend to identify more with the powerful, the boss, rather than their position as representing the worker. It seems almost designed to create that kind of identification, which would not work out well for the working class.
Yeah, you're taking workers who have learned from their daily experience that the boss not only has more power, but a sense that the boss actually represents technology, and he knows what the market is, and he knows who the suppliers are, and he has the connections. Yeah, so there's a psychological sense that the boss is coming to it with, a sense of running things, and the worker is coming, being intimidated, but also facing the fact that, well, doesn't the corporation have to do well so I can do well? So both the structural and the psychological impact of that, and that becomes very dangerous because once you're identifying with the boss as this is your company, of course, you're fragmenting the working class and you're competing with other workers, which is so crucial. The other thing that Botwinick says in his book, which is so important, and I don't think I appreciated it. I always thought of this more in terms of workers identifying with their boss, workers dependent on their own firm, being forced to compete to keep their jobs. But what Botwinick emphasizes is that when corporations are competing with each other, Each of them finds particular ways of competing that lead to a lot of variation in terms of capital intensity, whether you're going to do this by having high-skilled workers or low-skilled workers, low-paid workers. The fact of competition and every corporation finding different ways to compete leads to really two things. And one of them is all these differences within the working class, part-time workers, full-time workers, low wage, skilled, non-skilled. And that immediately creates this enormous difference. And so there's nothing spontaneous about thinking in class terms. In the union, you're thinking about how you protect yourself. There's a particularity about unions. They're not class organizations. They're defending their members, the random members that happen to be in that workplace. And then in addition to that, you have this difference in terms of wage structures and all the differences in health and safety and working conditions and whether they're actually going to stay there or not. And the other thing that happens is there's also this question of the reserve army. And in Marx, what used to be thought of as the reserve army of the unemployed, but it isn't. And that has to do with the point you were making about the changes in the labor market. The reserve army is really the threat that if you lose your job, and if it's a decent paying job, the alternative is so bad. Even if you get another job, you don't have to be unemployed. But if you're going to get another job that's going to be in terms of working conditions and health and safety and wages, that disciplines the whole class. So the point about the reserve army is that it begins to discipline the whole class. And the reason it can discipline the whole class is because in any workplace with decent wages, they're also always restructuring because of competition, introducing new technology. So there are always layoffs, even if there's new jobs someplace else. And that also raises the question of, whether you're going to be downwardly mobile. And that threat is disciplining the class as a whole. And the differentiation within the class is making it so hard to create a class out of this. And the working class organizations that they do have, like unions, don't overcome that because they're not class organizations. So thinking through competition raises all kinds of strategic questions.
Back in the late 90s, Alan Greenspan used to talk frequently about the fact that even though the unemployment rate was 4% or even a little lower at a couple of months, the working class was acting like it was much higher. There was a lot of anxiety about job loss, despite an apparently tight labor market. Here we are, a couple of decades later, and we're still in this situation where the working class is in this constant state of anxiety. Well, pre-pandemic, the unemployment rate was sustained below 4%. And
I think what happened was, I haven't seen people talk about this very much, but I think what happened, and what neoliberalism was so much about, was this forced restructuring of capital. The acceleration of globalization, liberalization of finance, letting interest rates go high, not just to weaken labor through high unemployment at that moment to break them, but on a continuous basis, having pressure on corporations to compete. And the point is that when corporations compete, some businesses will go under, but that's always pressuring corporations to compete more. And capital as a class comes out stronger. Whereas for workers, when they're forced to compete, it destroys the only strength they have, which is potential solidarity. So there's a different class impact. But a key point here is, I think, is that what we started getting in the 80s and into the 90s was a constant restructuring. The notion that capital needed these occasional downturns to discipline the system wasn't quite true. It was still true. Capital still has those recessions, whether they need them or not. Sometimes they just happen anyways. They don't have that kind of control. But the downturns actually didn't happen for long periods of time. You didn't have anything through the 90s until 2001. Even in the 80s, it wasn't until the end of the 80s that you had the recession. So there was this longer period without a recession. And yet within that period, there was massive restructuring going on. Restructuring didn't wait just until there was a downturn. Restructuring was accelerated, and it had this impact on the working class of making them permanently insecure.
It's like the capitalists had adopted Trotskyist permanent revolution strategy.
Yes. It was permanently insecure. And you could say for capital, in a sense, there was a permanent pressure of competition, either to hang on to what you have if you wanted to maintain your relatively privileged position, or to make breakthroughs. And what you really do see, if you look at the corporations that were the top 10 or 20 corporations in the 70s, and you look at that list, once you get to the new millennium, it's different companies. Even companies that kind of remain large, like General Motors, they actually go through a period where they actually were worried about disappearing. companies like GE aren't there anymore. And when you look at the top companies, what you find is, the predictable ones, Amazon, Walmart, the platform companies, and the health companies, which is also an interesting phenomenon in the States, that not having healthcare at one level makes each company less competitive because of the costs of healthcare aren't socialized. And yet healthcare has become this enormous space for accumulation for the United States. I think something like the top 10 health companies in the world in terms of equipment and supplying and privatization of hospitals and stuff, insurance, et cetera, are American.
On the left, there's lately been a return of a critique of monopoly, that monopoly is the problem. You have people like Matt Stoller pushing anti-monopoly position. There's been a growth in urge to prosecute antitrust in ways that we haven't seen in a few decades. What do you think of this? Is monopoly a problem? How monopolized is this economy? And is antitrust and breaking up big companies a solution to anything?
Yeah, I would just add to what you just said is that with that also comes the idea of breaking up the banks. So a few things about it. Like, yes, from a democratic perspective, the fact of these mammoth corporations, which have such a powerful hold on what happens in our lives in terms of what they do with investments and how it affects communities. So at that level, yes, monopoly is a problem, but to challenge that, you're actually challenging capitalism. In terms of monopoly, the way it's traditionally thought, and I think the way these people are thinking about it, they're thinking in terms of, the ability to set prices, for example. Well, that's not what competition is about right now. It isn't as if inflation has been the problem because of corporations raising prices. The point is they do compete, and they compete dynamically. And if anything, it's an excess of competition. One of the things I think we have to think about, maybe we can come back to that towards the end, is a left program has to think about how it limits competition. Because as long as you have intense competition or make it more intense, you're insisting that democratic questions can't be answered. Whoever you elect has to worry about how you make the economy and corporations in it more competitive. That has to be the goal of society. And, if you look at a company like Amazon, which everybody thinks in terms of this incredible monopoly, well, it's competing against retail companies quite successfully. It's competing with FedEx and UPS and delivery trucks. It's competing for the iCloud with all the other platform companies. It's crossing sectors and now competing through its whole food operations in retail food even. It's competing internationally because even though it dominates in the United States, there's a whole fight over who's going to dominate in Asia and China. And it's competing to maintain its position, which it doesn't want to lose. So there's intense competition, and that competition includes driving things down for workers. There's no aristocracy of labor at Amazon in terms of the warehouse workers and the workers delivering packages. If anything, what workers face is more competition. And in terms of the notion of monopoly as stagnation, kind of the Baran-Sweezy arguments at the end of the 50s into the 60s, that's not true either. I mean, what we're seeing is an incredible dynamic. I'm using that in a clinical way, not that I'm approving of it, but a real dynamic thrust in American capitalism in terms of changing things, in terms of changing industry, our lives, what goods we have, technologies. It's incredible, the amount that's invested in research and software. Globalization means new technologies in terms of distribution, how to carry more distribution loads in new kinds of ships. I mean, everything is changing and being transformed. It's a world of competition. And the problem with antitrust stuff is, as soon as you break up companies, first of all, you're going to have enormous instability for the workers. The argument that this will immediately help workers. I mean, whether it's good or not it's one thing, whether you want to break up some power. But the reality is that the power in the capitalist class remains. For workers, they're going to have incredible instability, as we saw when the airlines were deregulated or the communication companies were broken up. They just are competing more. They're going to have more competitors, and it's going to impact on their workers who are going to be restructured. In the financial sector, the idea of breaking up the banks doesn't solve the problem. What's the point of having more smaller banks who are competing with each other to become bigger banks and recreate that kind of concentration, and possibly having more instability if we have another crisis because these banks are smaller? This just isn't what the left should be focusing on. It's getting trapped into this notion of having more firms is more competition. And competition was never about the number of firms you had in an industry.
We're listening to the political economist Sam Gindin.
What I'd really argue that the left has to think about and isn't thinking about is how do you create spaces within capitalism? We're not about to end capitalism. How do you create spaces within capitalism that limit competition, and therefore by limiting competition have the space to change values and what is important in life, and through that, because it'll still have limits under capitalism, get people to think about what kind of society they want. And I think there's some real openings that we could use in this. One is the environment. The environment is a perfect space to say, leaving the environment to fragmented corporations competing with each other over profit, private corporations, isn't much of a strategy. We need to plan, and you can't plan unless you control what you're planning. And you have to plan in a way that's about social use, not hope that profitability will overlap and give you social use. So the environment is an incredible opportunity, and the environment isn't a marginal issue. I don't just mean socially, I mean economically. To deal with the environment means transforming everything about how we live, work, and travel. That's a big chunk of the economy. So making the environment as a place to fight over this question of competition leads to all kinds of other questions about public ownership and taking on class questions and questions of power. The public sector is another place. The public sector is supposed to not be determined by profitability and individual interests. And we have to take that more seriously. We have to say we do want it to be public. We want to expand it. We want not just universal health care and pharmacare, but we want to expand social services. But to say that, we also have to start recognizing that a lot of time this just leads to bureaucracy. We have to talk about democratizing the public sector. And that means taking on unions who just think in terms of their own conditions as well. We have to think about how do unions actually relate to the people that they're servicing, and together have an alliance that democratizes it, because it's the only way they're ever going to defend the public sector anyways.
In New York State, we have some of the public sector unions opposing an effort to bring single-payer healthcare to the state because they lose their advantage that way.
I saw that. And well, let me get to that in a second. I just want to give the third part of it. The third part of it is if you do the environment, if you really are expanding the public sector, and if you take on finance, and again, we're not strong enough to take over finance. I'm not sure we have the capacities to just take over finance and know what to do with it. But aside from that difficult question, we should be talking about some public banks, to deal with the environment, to deal with infrastructure, and actually to learn about finance, because the left doesn't know much about it. You're one of the exceptions, and you really are an exception. But if we have public banks, we cannot say this is a public bank and now it has to go out and compete. Again, it leads to the same end point. We have to say that we're going to put a levy on every financial institution. They owe it to us after everything we've given to them through all of this. And that levy will create a fund which will go to these public banks. And that way, the only question is, how do you democratically use those funds? How do you allocate those funds democratically for the environment, for infrastructure, for creating new jobs in communities when they're being restructured? So in all these ways, I think there's a chance to actually start engaging workers more. If you're linking the question of the restructuring in their communities because they're losing a particular factory or a particular service is being privatized, so that workers can start fighting for that, but fighting in the name of, we want different values. It's a public service, or we want it to be used for the environment because we need that. Then workers are engaged, and talking about things like just transitions isn't a slogan. And I think that through that engagement, and this has been my experience with workers, but once they're engaged in fighting and they begin to see expanding social services or addressing the environment as a solution rather than the problem, they suddenly actually begin to learn about the environment. They actually begin to read about it when they see it in the paper, and soon they figure it out. So there's all that potentials. But I do want to get back to what you said about New York and the unions, because this is fundamental. The left depends on unions as the agency. They're the foundation for the politics that we want. And we have to stop just defending unions. We're not doing them a favor by constantly defending them. We have to be ready to challenge them, because this demands a transformation of unions. If unions are going to remain relevant, it's not a question of unions doing wonderful and we're challenging them. Unions are, in spite of sporadic victories and courageous acts in some place, we're not going anywhere. And we have to ask why. How come we haven't been able to respond to all of this stuff? And it's because we have to transform unions. They have to begin to see that thinking in class terms isn't just some ideological thing. It's actually a pragmatic, practical way of winning. How do you actually organize? It isn't just a cost benefit analysis of why you want to organize an Amazon. It's because the class needs it. You have to organize low paid workers so they don't resent you and are willing to scab on you. So we have to think about class in it's a pragmatic and ideological thing. It represents a new kind of morality. And we have to think about actually understanding the economy.
With unions, is it just a matter of underdeveloped consciousness, or is there some structural thing that makes them so blinkered?
Well, let me say two things. One is we shouldn't romanticize the working class. Workers are not spontaneously revolutionary, nor are they spontaneously racist or conservative. The working class has to be made. It has the potential to play this role because of its role in production, because they create new kinds of communities in their workplace, which are hard to create in communities that are so isolated from where people are so isolated from each other. So there's something about work that both gives you power and gives you a sense of community and gives you a place to resist, so you form your own structures. That is powerful. But the problem with it is, on the one hand, what you learn as a worker in capitalism is that you're dependent. What you learn is that to survive, you got to think about the long term and can't busy yourself. I'm sorry, the short term, and can't busy yourself with the long term. You got to survive in the short term. You end up exhausted in terms of reading and thinking and going to meetings. You're fragmented because your situation is so different from other workers, or you're competing with them. So workers aren't spontaneously radical. This is something that has to be made and built. And workers may resist, but that comes and goes. That's why you need some larger organizations. Now, the problem with unions as an organization is that they are a vehicle for fighting, but they're a fragmented vehicle. They're particular organizations. They're supposed to represent their members. And even if they're very democratic, which is a lot of what the left criticizes them for, not being democratic, but you can have democratic unions who say, why do you care about Palestine? What do you care if some workers are getting the minimum wage? We're doing better than that. So being democratic isn't enough, because that can also make you insular. That can lead you to duplicating neoliberalism by thinking individually or in terms of only your union. You have to transform unions. And once you start thinking about different kinds of unions, unions that are mobilizing in the community around leading the fight for social services, leading the fight around the environment, mobilizing their members to be organizers and teaching them that. It means changing everything about your organization, what you put your money into, what kind of education you do, what your staff does. It's a question of transforming unions. Now, unions can't be socialist organizations. They're still just unions, but there is space for raising class questions and raising questions about how we understand capitalism, which creates openings for maybe doing some education around socialism, but we still need a socialist organization. We need something that has its feet in unions and its feet outside unions, whose main preoccupation is how do we transform society, not just how do we improve the conditions of a particular work. And that kind of a space where you strategize, which is so focused on developing the capacities and understanding and vision and strategic ability and organizing ability of workers and unions, we don't have. And so I've said this to you before when we were talking about the crisis in labor, that part of the crisis in labor is simultaneously a crisis on the left, which isn't embedded in the labor movement. And that's a difficult question, because embedded in this isn't just going to a picket line. It's actually about living in their communities, being part of their culture. And you really see that in England, in the north of England, where places that were so labor, the only debates used to be about whether people were going to be communists or labor supporters, have gone to the right. We have to appreciate the extent of the defeat we've had. It isn't just that people have lost some wages or pensions. It's that there's been a lowering of expectations and an exposure of how weak our institutions are. And it's going to take a lot to rebuild this. And one of the things that has to happen in the States is that the Sanders moment was very important, even though people like myself and Leo, had anybody asked us, would have said, what are you doing running in the Democratic Party? The reality is that Sanders created space He affected the discourse. When I say space, I mean space for the left. And he expanded the discourse, brought a lot of young people into politics. And we have to make sure we don't lose this. I mean, there was an infrastructure of communications and education and organizing and mobilizing. We can't lose this. And that's why I think campaigns are so important. The other thing we have to worry about, I think there's a real danger of social democratization. People are going to go into the Democratic Party. Even socialists are going to do that. Given that they don't see another option, we have to assume that a lot of good socialists will go into the Democratic Party. And we can argue with them about the limits of it. But I think we have to figure out how to keep engaging them rather than just write them off. And engaging them means having campaigns, some national campaigns, so people don't just retreat to doing things locally. But the point of national campaigns is it'll constantly expose the Democratic Party. And I think we need that, even if you're working within it. Because otherwise people will get trapped into small battles. And, every small thing that's won will be seen as wonderful. And we lose what we're actually fighting for as socialists. And the other thing is that's the only way to engage in those larger battles, to build something outside the Democratic Party for when the socialists either leave or more likely get kicked out of the Democratic Party, and have some kind of a working class base to go to after that, including just other socialists to go to.
That was Sam Gindin. His review of Howard Botwinick's book, Persistent Inequalities, under the provocative title Why Workers Don't Revolt, was recently posted to the Jacobin website. My name is Doug Henwood, and the program is Behind the News.